Hey everyone, welcome back to Stadium Stats for yet another season. Kicking off with week 2 of the NFL season. So, thank you so much for tuning in previous seasons. For those who have, thank you to new listeners and viewers who are tuning in for the first time this season. I will be trying my best to post as many weeks of the NFL season as I possibly can, going through my predictions for who's going to win and lose each individual matchup, and then going into my top 10 power rankings at the end. So, without further ado, let's get into the week 2 predictions. Starting off on Thursday Night Football, we have the Commanders taking on the Packers. The Commanders, they're coming off a dominant win over the Giants in a game where they won 6-21. They played really well on offense at points, but they were pretty spotty as Jaden Daniels did end up playing well, but he had a pretty slow start. They did have a decent run game, which appeared to get better as the game progressed, as their rookie Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, as a lot of people have hyped him up, he did end up scoring, and that ended up really helping the team towards the end. The real star of the show, though, was their defense, as they really only led up 6 points to the Giants in Russell Wilson's first start with the team, which was supposed to be an upgrade over what they had last year. However, the Giants could not get anything going on offense. Not even Malik Nabers could really get going. And the Commanders' run defense played really well as well, so that was exceptional. The Packers, on the other hand, they played unbelievable. They took on the Lions and they won big, winning 27-13 in a game where the final score makes it seem closer than it actually was, as they were up by 3 touchdowns up until the Lions ended up scoring in garbage time with about a minute left. The Packers looked unstoppable on offense as they were scoring on most drives. Jordan Love did throw one pretty ugly interception, but besides that, their offense looked really good. They had a great run game, they had a great pass game, and their defense looked unbelievable as they were able to hold the Lions, who were scoring over 30 points casually in almost every game last year, to only 6 points through most of that game up until garbage time, in which, yes, Isaac Tesla, the rookie, did get a touchdown grab right at the end. However, that touchdown could not have been defended any better anyways. So the Packers' defense itself looked great. Micah Parsons got his first sack as a Packer. And yes, Micah Parsons got traded there in the offseason, really looking like he's making a difference for that defense, even while being limited. So I'm going to say, in this first matchup, I think both teams have a great shot, as the Commanders are awesome on offense and defense as well, but I'm going to go with the Packers to win this one, as they seem like the most unstoppable team in the NFC right now. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Giants and the Cowboys. The Giants, they're coming off a terrible loss to the Commanders, where they only put up 6 points. It's the third year in a row where have yet to score a touchdown, which is the first time since 1942 that has happened to any team. They looked pitiful on offense. Their defense did hold the Commanders pretty well, especially towards the beginning, but did let up at points, and was, not to say a letdown, but wasn't that a bright spot either. The Cowboys, on the other hand, they actually held their own after trading Micah Parsons to the Packers. They held their own against the reigning Super Bowl champion Eagles in a game where they lost 20-24 in what was really a weird opening game of the season. Jalen Carter got ejected right away from the Eagles, which gave the Cowboys a big boost. The Cowboys actually had a run game throughout that game. Javonte Williams ended up scoring 2 touchdowns. Miles Sanders had a 50-yard rush, although he then ended up fumbling right after. The Cowboys looked considerably better than what they looked like last year. Dak Prescott played pretty well. CeeDee Lamb was very hit or miss, as he did have over 100 yards, but he also had 4 drops, including 2 really crucial drops that ended up costing the Cowboys the game. So it looks like they're a better team than they were in last year. but they still have room to grow and did not come away with that win. But I do think that changes here as they take down their division rival in the Giants, who are not a very good team as of right now. So we'll see if the Giants can bounce back. We'll see if the Cowboys can bounce back. But I think it's more likely the Cowboys do. Up next, we have a matchup between the Seahawks and the Steelers. The Seahawks, they're coming off a loss to the 49ers in a game where they lost 17-13, and their offense couldn't do almost anything that whole game. Kenneth Walker looked pitiful throughout most of that game. Zach Charbonnet did look considerably better, though. Jackson Smith-Njigba was the only bright spot on that whole offense, as he had over 100 receiving yards, making up for over 2/3 of Sam Darnold's total passing yards. And Sam Darnold really did not look that good. They had under 250 yards of offense, as through most of that game they had under 100 offensive passing yards and under 100 rushing yards as well. The Seahawks defense did play pretty well, especially in the red zone, as they were able to hold the 49ers on multiple drives. However, some of those drives would have resulted in scoring if the 49ers special teams was any better, as they missed 2 kicks, one of which was from the Seahawks' own skill, as they were able to block one of those field goals. However, the other one was entirely on the 49ers, and the 49ers were seemingly able to get into red zone territory pretty easily. The Steelers, on the other hand, they were in a total shootout against the New York Jets in a game where they came away with a win 34-32. Aaron Rodgers threw 4 passing touchdowns to 0 interceptions with a passer rating of 136. He played really well. He was really happy to get his revenge on the Jets, and Justin Fields on the other side played really well as well. But the Steelers defense did end up giving up a lot of points to the Jets. It looked like a weak spot of that team, which is normally a really big, strong spot. However, their offense did look pretty good, but it doesn't look sustainable. They didn't have any standout players besides Aaron Rodgers, who was really spreading the ball around, but there wasn't any player that stood out as a weapon. So I am going to still go with the Steelers to beat the Seahawks, as I do think the Seahawks have some growing pains getting used to having Sam Darnold there. And while the Seahawks defense did look considerably better than the Steelers offense actually worked, whereas the Seahawks did not. And I believe the Steelers offense will be more than the Seahawks offense can produce, and therefore will come away with more points and win the game. Moving on, we've got a matchup between the Rams versus the Titans. The Rams, they're coming off a win 14-9 against the Texans in a game where they scored 2 touchdowns and only let up 3 field goals, which is pretty good defensively. Offensively, they didn't look spectacular, but Puka Nacua did miss some of the game with a concussion, and while Davante Adams did mesh well with Puka Nacua, he didn't seemingly do much while Puka Nacua was gone off the field, so it's unclear as to whether he's able to produce on his own at this point in this offense, but that also could very well and is very likely due to how good the Texans' defense is. Texans' defense was holding the Rams through most of that game, and Matthew Stafford just ended up coming away with it and having a really, really excellent game. Kyren Williams did look pretty good as well. Titans, on the other hand, they looked meh. It's really hard to say because no one had high expectations for this team, and so therefore it's hard to say whether they overperformed from those expectations, because they were going against an elite defense, or what's supposed to be an elite defense, in the Denver Broncos, and the Denver Broncos still held them to 12 points, which was to be expected in Cam Ward's first start. Cam Ward, the number 1 overall draft pick, looked all right. He didn't throw an interception, and he just didn't really get much going, as he had barely around 100 yards and also had a terrible completion percentage. The Titans, they're not going to be a good team. Their defense, though, did look really good, as the Broncos had really high expectations, and the Titans forced 3 turnovers from the Broncos and held them to 20 points. The Broncos did eventually score 2 touchdowns, but for most of that game, the Titans were holding the Broncos to really look pitiful on offense. I don't think people have higher expectations from the Titans from this game, and therefore I do think, given the high expectations that the Rams have, the Rams are going to come away with the win here. But maybe the Titans can look good. Maybe Cam Ward can have an improvement from his first start to his second start and start looking better. And hopefully, for his sake, he can, because that team needs some wins, as they looked terrible last year, and we're not off to the best start this year. But again, you got to give them some slack, cut them some slack, as they have a rookie quarterback in his first ever start. And statistically speaking, since the early 2000s, that is not the method for winning in their first career start, as first overall quarterbacks have been 1-13-1 in their first overall starts. So I am going to go with the Rams, but maybe the Titans can look just like they did this week, or at least their defense can, as their offense starts picking up the pace with Cam Ward. Up next, we have a matchup between the Bills and the Jets. The Bills, they looked unreal in that game. They were up front at first, and then they fell behind and almost did not come back for most of that game, and then ended up coming away with a win 41-40 against the Ravens in a game that was honestly one of the all-time classics. It was an unbelievable Sunday Night Football game. The Bills were down 15 points with it in the middle of the fourth quarter, and ended up coming away with a win, as the Ravens were up 40-25 and lost 40-41 after missing an extra point, and then the Bills scored 2 touchdowns and a field goal. The Bills, their offense looked unbelievable. Their defense, though, was getting gutted by the run game of the Ravens, as Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry were running all over the Bills' defense. The Bills' defense definitely needs to pick up the pace, and honestly very quickly, because they are supposed to be a Super Bowl contender, and that defense looked horrendous for most of that game. They did end up picking up the pace towards the end of that game, as they were able to force a fumble on Derrick Henry, which then resulted in points for their offense, and as well as that, they were able to hold the Ravens to 0 points after that score, bringing them to 40, even though there was still significant time left in the fourth quarter, and the Ravens had been scoring at an incredibly frequent pace. So they did clearly slow down the Ravens towards the end of that game and start figuring them out. But that Bills defense needs to pick up their pace and pick it up soon. The Jets, on the other hand, their offense looked fantastic. Justin Fields looked really, really good. The connection with Garrett Wilson looked great. Breece Hall looked really, really good. And unfortunately, their defense just did not, as they let up a few last-minute scores. Aaron Rodgers threw for 4 touchdowns to 0 interceptions and had a passer rating of over 136. And that Jets defense, ironically, did not look good, considering all the pieces that they have and their new defensive-minded head coach in Aaron Glenn. I do think this will be a close matchup, because I think both offenses have the potential to be really good when they start performing. And I think the Bills are more likely to perform on offense, but I think the Jets are more likely to perform on defense. And both have a little bit to figure out on the other side of the ball. I am going to go with the Bills to win this matchup. However, I do think the Jets put up a good fight in this one, especially considering it is a divisional matchup. I do think it'll be played relatively close, but the Bills typically do beat the Jets, and they are a better team on paper. Their offense is better, and I am going to go with them to win. Up next is the other matchup in that same division, the Patriots taking on the Dolphins. The Patriots, they took on the Raiders in a game where they lost 13-20. The Raiders really looked good on offense at first, and the Patriots defense looked like it was going to be off to a rough start, and then they really held their own for most of that game. Unfortunately, the Patriots offense could not keep up with that defense, as the Patriots offense was only able to put up 13 points and really did not look that good. Drake May looked all right. He did throw an interception, and it was pretty ugly. As for the run game, it was all right, but Travion Henderson looked decent in his first game, and the Patriots defense was at least passable, if not decent, for most of that game. The Dolphins, on the other hand, looked like arguably the worst team in the entire league, as they lost by a lot to the Colts, losing 33-8 in a game where Tua had multiple interceptions. They couldn't get anything going in the pass game with Jalen Waddle or Tyreek Hill. Achane looked all right, and outside of that, they really had nothing going for them. Their defense looked horrendous. They were turning the ball over constantly and just looked terrible, and not like the high-power offensive team we've known them to become over the past few years. I do think this is going to be a lot closer, as it is a divisional matchup, and considering that neither team looked great, if not looked pretty bad in the case of the Dolphins, I am going to say that it is going to be a close game, and it could go either way, but I'm going to go with the Patriots to win this game. I do think the Dolphins very well could have a bounce back, but I don't think there's any guarantees of that at all, as the Dolphins could totally just be a bad team this year. Up next, we have a matchup between the Jaguars and the Bengals. The Jaguars, they're coming off a win over the Panthers 26-10 in a game that ended up getting rain delayed and for a while, actually. But the Jaguars' offense did look pretty good. Trevor Lawrence played pretty well. Travis Hunter and Brian Thomas looked like a decent receiving duo already. And the real star of the show was Travis Etienne, who had 16 rushes for 140 yards. And the Jaguars' defense also looked really good, as they held the Panthers to 10 points, had multiple turnovers, and just stopped the Panthers from continuing their development from last year and continuing Bryce Young's development from last year, as Bryce Young looked significantly worse than what he looked like at the end of last year. The Jaguars do look like a considerably better team than last year, and a lot of that also does have to do with their new head coach, Liam Cohen, who looks like he's made a difference for that offense, and maybe that's why Travis Etienne has figured it out, or maybe it was just the Panthers' defense being really bad. On the other hand, the Bengals, they came off a 17-16 win over the Browns in a game where Joe Burrow looked pretty mediocre. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins did not look that good, and their defense really was surprisingly the star of the show, because their defense last year, next to the Panthers, was the worst in the league. But they ended up coming away with a few key turnovers and did hold the Browns to only 16. This game could end up going in the Jaguars' favor, as the Jaguars have yet to show if they are a good team or if they were just playing a bad Panthers team. But I am going to go with the Bengals to win this one, as I do think Jamar Chase and T. Higgins have bounce-back games and play a lot better, and that offense gets going, and the Bengals look like what they looked like in previous years. It's yet to be seen, though, what that defense will look like. Moving on, we have a matchup between the San Francisco 49ers and the New Orleans Saints, as the 49ers are coming off a 17-13 win over the Seattle Seahawks in a game where Brock Purdy did throw for 2 touchdowns but also had 2 interceptions. Ricky Pearsall had over 100 receiving yards. Christian McCaffrey looked great in his return with over 100 yards through scrimmage. The problem was George Kittle got hurt and Juwan Jennings got hurt, and they went into the game without Brandon Ayuk, who is starting the season on IR and missing at least the first 4 games of the year. The 49ers are really down in receiving weapons. However, their run game looked great, as the addition of Brian Robinson Jr. looked fantastic as a complement to Christian McCaffrey to take some of that load off. McCaffrey, as I said, looked really, really good in both the receiving and the run game. and Brock Purdy looked a lot more confident just having McCaffrey out there. The defense also looked phenomenal as they were able to hold the Seahawks to 13 points and under 250 yards of offense. The Saints, on the other hand, they looked all right. They were playing a Cardinals team that is okay from based on last year, and still lost 20-13. They don't really have a quarterback. Alvin Kamara is seemingly most of their offense, as he's still really good in the run game and receiving game. But other than that, they don't have a lot going for them. Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are both two good receiving weapons, but they're both injury prone, and that was seen today as Olave had 2 visits to the medical tent. In addition, the Saints, just as I said, don't really have a quarterback situation figured out. And their defense is all right, but it's not anything to write home about. The 49ers, especially with the help of Robert Saleh being back at the lead of that defense, should come away with a win here, especially if their defense is as stifling as it was last week, or especially considering the Saints don't have much of a quarterback. So I'm going to go with the 49ers to win. Up next, we have a divisional matchup between the Browns and the Ravens. The Browns, they're coming off a loss 16-17 versus the Bengals in a game where Joe Flacco looked all right. Their run game looked pretty bad, and their defense was really the star of the show as they were able to hold Joe Burrow to a pretty poor completion percentage by his standards, as well as able to hold T. Higgins to very few yards, as well as Jamar Chase to literally only 26 yards. So, pretty impressive performance, especially by those Browns corners, but their offense really didn't look that good. Their rookie tight end did look pretty good, had 7 receptions, which is the most all-time for a rookie tight end in week 1, tied with Tyler Warren for the Colts in the same week. But outside of him, Jerry Jeudy didn't look that good. Cedric Tillman looked all right, and the run game didn't look very good, so that offense is not very promising. The Ravens, on the other hand, they're coming off a really disappointing loss in an unreal game versus the Bills in a game where they lost 40-41, had the lead by 15 with under a quarter to go, and ended up not scoring any more points and letting up 16 points for the Bills to come back and win. The Ravens' offense looked like it could seemingly do anything for most of that game, as their run game looked unstoppable. Derrick Henry had over 150 rushing yards yet again for the 7th time in his career, tying him with Walter Payton as the only player to ever do it 7 times in 7 different games. In addition to that, Lamar Jackson played really, really well as Zay Flowers having over 100 receiving yards. Mark Andrews seemingly was nowhere to be found, though, and Isaiah Likely was out with an injury. The Ravens' defense seemingly was poor. Their defense looked good at points through that game, but through most of that game, especially towards the end, the Bills were having their way with them, and especially Josh Allen. And that can't be understated that it is Josh Allen against that defense, but still, they let up 41 points. That is unacceptable for that defense. That being said, I do think the Ravens' offense is so much better than the Browns that they still should come away with a win next week, as well as their defense should bounce back, considering who their opponent is. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Browns' defense is able to hold the Ravens a lot better than the Bills were able to. And I also wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens' defense looked considerably better going against the Browns' offense. That all being said, I am going to still pick the Ravens to win this divisional matchup, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Browns make it a close one or even pull away one of the 2 matchups this year. So I am going to go with the Ravens to win, but I'm not ruling the Browns out. Moving on, we have a matchup between the Broncos and the Colts. The Broncos, they're coming off a win 20-12 over the Titans in a game where Bo Nix had 3 turnovers. They really did not look that good for parts of that game, and for other parts looked really good. Their passing game looked all right at best, as Bo Nix had under 200 yards and, as I said, had 3 turnovers. And in addition, their run game started off slow but progressively got better and better, and RJ Harvey and J.K. Dobbins both had big runs in in a moment that ended up turning the tide for that game, as they ended up coming away with the win. And their defense was very stifling. Yes, they were playing Cam Ward in his first start, but that defense has really high expectations and seemingly lived up to it in that first game. The Colts, on the other hand, looked like one of the most dominant teams imaginable, and it's yet to be seen how that happened, as their quarterback is Daniel Jones, who played the best of any quarterback this week, especially in fantasy football for those who play, as Daniel Jones scored on every single possession of offense. That is the first time that's happened in the modern era, as there have been other examples of that basically happening, but with kneel downs. That didn't even happen in this game. There weren't even kneel downs. Daniel Jones scored on every drive he had the ball. The Colts offense looked really good. Michael Pittman looked great. The receiving core as a whole looked great. Their pass game through Daniel Jones, their run game through Daniel Jones, their run game through Jonathan Taylor. Their defense looked phenomenal as they held the Dolphins to 8 points. It's yet to be seen what this team could be, as they went into the season with very low expectations and seemingly blew those out of the water in week 1. So it's yet to be seen how much that'll fluctuate this season, and so that makes this game really hard to pick, as the Broncos are coming off a game in which they were underwhelming, and the Colts were coming off a game in which they were overwhelming. So I'm really unsure on this one, and I wouldn't be surprised with it going either direction. However, given their expectations going into the season and given who their quarterbacks have been in previous years, I am going to go with the Broncos to win, especially considering their defense is seemingly supposed to be one of the best units in the entire league. And while the Colts defense looked phenomenal last week, they didn't look that great last year, and it's yet to be seen how much of that has changed or if they got lucky in week 1. So I am going to go with the Broncos in case both teams return to normal or what is seemingly their expectations. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Colts win this one in the slightest. Moving on, we have a matchup between the Panthers and the Cardinals. The Panthers, they're coming off a really disappointing loss in a game versus the Jaguars that they lost 10-26, as Bryce Young had multiple turnovers. They really couldn't get much going on offense, and Teteroa McMillan, the rookie, was the only bright spot on that team, as their defense also looked pretty poor, letting up 26 to the Jaguars and letting up almost 10 yards a carry to Travis Etienne, who had a really poor season last year and had an amazing bounce back in week 1. On the other hand, we have the Cardinals, who did come away with a win against what is seemingly one of the worst teams in the league, in the Saints, who don't really have a quarterback, and they still only won 20-13 in what was kind of an underwhelming game, both on offense and defense, but still got enough done to win, and there really wasn't a lot to complain about. They looked all right. Kyler Murray looked pretty good. Their pass game through Marvin Harrison looked pretty good, and Trey McBride did have 6 catches for 60 yards, although he didn't have a score and didn't do anything exceptional, and that was really the story of that offense. Nothing exceptional. Doesn't mean they were bad, doesn't mean they were a letdown, but they didn't do anything to blow you out of the water. That being said, I do think they are a better team than the Panthers, and I am going to pick the Cardinals to win this game. But the Panthers could have a bounce back, as Bryce Young is really desperate to have that bounce back game and prove that that quarterback he was at the end of last year is who he actually is and not who showed up in week 1. So let's see how the Panthers do, if they can bounce back. But I think given how bad the Panthers' defense is, the Cardinals are going to win this game. Moving on, we have a matchup between the Eagles and the Chiefs. Yes, a Super Bowl rematch from last year. The Eagles, they're coming off a 24-20 win over the Cowboys in a game where Jalen Carter got ejected and they still won. Their defensive line looked a lot worse than it did last year, as they lost Josh Sweat in free agency, traded Bryce Huff to the 49ers, and then lost Jalen Carter, their best defensive lineman, to an ejection, and it is still yet to be seen what punishments he will face as of the time of me recording this. So I'm assuming he's playing versus the Chiefs, but it is possible he gets suspended. The Eagles, though, their run game went right back to where it was last year with Saquon and Jalen Hurts both playing really well on the ground. Saquon having a really good game in yardage and Jalen Hurts having the rushing touchdowns to boot. But their passing game really didn't look that good, as A.J. Brown had one catch and Devontae Smith only had a few, for very little yardage between the two of them, as the passing game took a backseat to their run game and their defense. Their defense, though, as I said, did take a step back from last year, but we'll see if they can get better while having one of their best defensive players back on the field, as Jalen Carter spit on Dak Prescott and got ejected right away, and we did not get to see that defense with Jalen Carter at all. The Chiefs, on the other hand, they lost a game to the Chargers in Brazil, 27-21. Their offense did not look good almost that entire game, as they were only still in that game by the end, as Travis Kelce had one big play. And other than that, Travis Kelce looked really washed and did not look like the same player he's been in previous years. He also hurt Xavier Worthy, who has a shoulder injury, and Rashee Rice is going to miss the first 6 games due to suspension. So there's really not a lot of receiving weapons in that offense, as well as their run game did not look that good. Their defense also didn't look very good, as they were one of the top units in the league last year and ended up letting over 300 yards to Justin Herbert, who ended up having an unbelievable game, as well as both in the air and on the ground. And all 3 of the Chargers starting receivers played really well, as Quentin Johnson had two touchdowns. Keenan Allen looked great in his role, returning to the Chargers, as well as having Ladd McConkey continuing from where he left off last season with an unreal rookie season and a good, strong start to his sophomore season. I do think the Chiefs are a worse team than what they were last year, and I think the Eagles are a worse team as well from where they were last year. So I do think it could be close in that sense. However, where we saw them last playing each other, the Eagles were demolishing the Chiefs. And I do think the Eagles are still a better team than the Chiefs, both in run game and in defense. The only thing that they seemingly are worse at is the actual passing, but they have better weapons. Mahomes doesn't have much to go with right now. So I am going to pick the Eagles to win this game. But I do think the Chiefs will be able to put up a fight, especially considering they want revenge for losing their out on the possible three-peat, which would have made NFL history. I do think the Chiefs are going to be angry and come into this game wanting revenge, and I do think they'll put up a good fight, but I do think the Eagles will win. Up next, we have a matchup between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Houston Texans. The Buccaneers are coming off an amazing, clutch win over a division rival in the Atlanta Falcons in a game where they won 23-20. That game almost went to overtime, as the Falcons did try to kick a game-tying field goal and did miss, which would have brought the game to overtime. But the Buccaneers looked pretty bad through most of that game. Their defense looked great, as they were stopping the run really effectively. But Michael Penix was throwing really well on that defense. And Michael Penix doesn't have a ton of experience in the NFL, so that wasn't the most promising sign for the Buccaneers defense. But the Falcons did really slow down in that second half, as they really couldn't get anything going in the run game, thanks a lot to the Buccaneers defense. The Buccaneers also really benefited from their first-round draft pick, Emeka Egbuka, stepping up and catching 2 touchdowns, including the game winner, which ended up sealing the game after the Atlanta Falcons missed that field goal. The Buccaneers looked very beatable, but they still came away with a win in a divisional game, which is what matters most. The Texans, on the other hand, they lost a game to the Rams 9-14, where they looked pretty bad. Their defense played really well, as they held the Rams to only 2 touchdowns, and the Rams' offense can be really explosive at times. So it's yet to be seen, but that could be a good sign of things to come for this Texans defense. However, Their offense looked putrid. They had no offensive line, which was the concern they had going into the season. They traded away Laramie Tunsil after having a really bad season offensive line-wise last year. They traded away their best offensive linemen and have only gotten worse on that offensive line. The Texans really couldn't get anything going. Their run game with Nick Chubb did look pretty good, but they didn't have a great run game outside of him, and he was efficient, but he wasn't mind-blowing. On the other hand, their pass game really didn't look good, as C.J. Stroud couldn't get much going behind that offensive line, and Nico Collins, their number one receiver, only had 5 targets and 3 receptions. The Texans looked very beatable. The Buccaneers looked very beatable, and I do think this is going to be a very close game. I think both of these teams were playoff teams last year and were pretty good. However, they both have flaws. The Buccaneers very much have a poor pass defense. The Texans have a great defense, but they have a very poor offensive line. So I think this game comes down to the trenches, because if the Buccaneers' defensive line can take advantage of the Texans' offensive line, just like the Rams did, or even to a fraction of that, I think the Buccaneers come away with a win. And so that's why I'm going to pick the Buccaneers in this game, but I really wouldn't be surprised if the Texans were able to pull this one off, especially if their offensive line steps up from where it was last week. Next, we have a divisional matchup between the Chargers and the Raiders. The Chargers, they're coming off a divisional win over the Chiefs in Brazil, 27-21, in a game where Justin Herbert played out of his mind, had over 300 yards, was rushing really well. All 3 of their top receivers played really well. Quentin Johnson had 2 touchdowns. Keenan Allen had a touchdown, and Ladd McConkey just looked great. They also had a pretty good run game, not anything exceptional, but the Chiefs' defense is known to be pretty good. At least they were last year. So the Chargers really could step up against a poor defense, especially in the run game after Omarion Hampton had a decent rookie debut. The Raiders, on the other hand, their offense looked really good at times and looked meh at other times. Brock Bowers played really, really well and then got hurt, and it was looking really bad as it was a non-contact knee injury, but it's looking like he's going to come back pretty soon. So that shouldn't be much of an issue, and assuming that isn't, that's a huge boost to that offense getting him back. Jacoby Myers, Geno Smith, their connection seemed great. Ashton Jeanty played all right in his rookie debut, but I'm excited to see this matchup between 2 division rivals, between the top 2 running backs drafted in this year's draft. I'm excited to see what that holds. The Chargers' defense has been unbelievable. Last year, they let up the least amount of yards. This year, off to a great start as the Chiefs' offense looked pretty putrid at moments against them. So I am going to go with the Chargers to win this one. I do think the Raiders are going to be much more of a thorn in every team's side that they play this year. And I do think they're going to be decent, but I think the Chargers are a really good team and therefore come away with a win here. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Raiders sneak away one of them in their 2 matchups. I just don't think it's going to be this early. Up next, we have a divisional matchup between the Bears and the Lions. The Lions, they're coming off a terrible game against the Packers in which they couldn't do anything on offense up until garbage time, where their rookie Isaac Tesla had an amazing one-handed reception, but that was their only touchdown. They had 2 field goals before that, and that was it for offense. And their defense didn't do much to stop the Packers at all. Their offensive line looked way worse without Ben Johnson, without Frank Ragnow, without a couple other pieces on that offensive line. And their offense just didn't have flow without the play calling of Ben Johnson. That being said, Ben Johnson, the head coach for the Bears, just choked away the game. He and Dennis Allen, the defensive coordinator of the Bears, were putting on a great performance through the first 3 quarters, including a pick 6 on J.J. McCarthy to put them up 17-6. And then they ended up losing 27-24 by the end of the game because they let up 3 straight touchdowns to the Vikings, who had been absolutely stagnant all game. Very poor performance by the Bears in clutch time, but very poor performance by the Lions throughout the entirety of the game. So it is yet to be seen how this will go, and is yet to be seen what kind of team each of these are. The Bears are clearly chokers. Are the Lions good and they just played a really good Packers team? Are the Lions just not what they used to be? Yet to be seen. I am going to go with the Lions to win this one, but I really wouldn't be surprised if the Bears do win this one, as the Lions did not look like themselves in that last game, but I wouldn't be surprised to see them bounce back. And finally, we have a matchup between the Falcons and the Vikings. The Vikings had a crazy comeback win against the Bears on Monday Night Football in a game where J.J. McCarthy started off really rough. That offense had nothing going. They had no rushing yards through the first 3 quarters, or barely any, and they only had 6 points, and then they scored 3 straight touchdowns and won the game. The Falcons, on the other hand, they missed a game-tying field goal to bring the game to overtime in a game where Michael Penix played really well, and that defense played really well through most of the game as they held Baker Mayfield to, honestly, not a great game. But Emeka Egbuka, the Buccaneers' first-round pick, kept torching the Falcons' defense and was a bit too much for them to handle. I do think the Falcons are a better team than the Vikings, and I do think the Vikings could totally be a really good team this year, but I actually think the Falcons are going to win this one, as I do think the Vikings played the Bears way closer than they should have and looked terrible through 3 quarters of that game, and I wouldn't be surprised if J.J. McCarthy is a little rusty starting off the season, as he hasn't played meaningful football since college. And so therefore, I am going to go with the Falcons to win this one. I think Michael Penix, as of right now, has more established than J.J. McCarthy, but I really wouldn't be surprised with either way this goes, but I am going to choose the Falcons anyways. Moving on to my top 10 power rankings. First, I'm going to go into a few honorable mentions. The Steelers, their offense looked great, but their defense didn't look like what a typical Steelers defense looks like. If their defense can rebound, I really do think this is a competitive team. The Bengals, they did win their game. Their defense actually looked much improved from last year, but their offense really couldn't do much. But I'm sure Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, and T. Higgins will have a bounce back. The 49ers, their special teams looked horrendous, but they cut their kicker, Jake Moody. So if their special teams can improve, maybe this team can actually be good, seeing as their defense played outstanding against the Seahawks through most of that game. And the Chiefs, you can never count them out. They have Patrick Mahomes. He played unbelievable, but the rest of the team just did not look that good. Moving on, though, to the top 10. At 10, I've got the Broncos. Bo Nix needs to rebound from that game. That was a really rough game for him. But that defense looks outstanding. One of the best units, if not the best unit in the entire league. I really do worry about any team that has to play the Broncos, as their offense is going to struggle against that Broncos defense. As long as the Broncos offense can rebound to what it looked like last year and have an improved running game like it seemed like they did in that first game, I think this Broncos team will be really good. At number 9, I've got the Colts. They actually played the best of any team this past week. I just don't think talent-wise on paper they are the most talented team, especially considering their quarterback is Daniel Jones. But Daniel Jones played great in that game. Their offense played outstanding. Their defense played outstanding. Really not a lot you can complain about as a Colts fan. That was about as good of a game as you could have expected. I just don't see that happening every week. At 8, I've got the Buccaneers. Baker Mayfield needs to step up from where he was last week, but the rest of that offense looked pretty good. Mike Evans and Emeka Egbuka look like a great receiving core, especially once Chris Godwin comes back. Bucky Irving, obviously a great running back. Their defense looked really good for a lot of that game. Also had some down moments, though, as Michael Penix did look really good in that game. But overall, I think the Buccaneers are a pretty good team. 7, the Ravens. Their offense looks unbelievable. The best in the league. Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry look unstoppable, although Derrick Henry did fumble that ball, which did end up costing them the game. But I do think that duo is nearly unstoppable. They put up 40 points. Their defense is just really choke-inducing as they threw away a 15-point lead in less than 5 minutes. That can't happen, and that's on the coaching staff as well. So on paper, the Ravens are incredible. Their offense looks incredible. Their defense, not so much. 6, I've got the Chargers. They played outstanding. They beat the Chiefs. Beating Mahomes is always an accomplishment. Second time the Chiefs lost in a row, which hasn't happened in over a year. The Chargers just played outstanding football. Their defense looked great. The Chiefs couldn't really do much on offense. The Chargers' offense looked great. Their receivers were all playing well. Justin Herbert played outstanding. The run game did have some room for improvement, and it will be nice to see Omarion Hampton continue to improve as he gets more and more attempts in his rookie season. So I do think that run game will continue to improve, but the offense and defense both look really good. At 5, I've got the Commanders. They played really well, but they played the Giants, who are seemingly not a good team. That being said, it is a divisional game, and they destroyed the Giants. And Jaden Daniels looked great, and their defense looked great. Deebo Samuel also looked great in his debut with the Commanders, and for all those reasons, I have them in at number 5, and I think they're going to win a lot of football games. At 4, I've got the Rams. They looked unbelievable on defense. They held the Texans to 9 points. They kept sacking C.J. Stroud, although C.J. Stroud does not really have much of an offensive line in front of him. And their offense, while Puka was out there, looked great. Puka and Devontae Adams both were doing a lot while Puka was out there. The problem was Puka was hurt for part of that game, and it seemed like they had no offense without him. Their only other weapon was Kyren Williams, who got a touchdown. But I do think if their team can stay healthy, I do think they have a lot of potential. At 3, I've got the Bills. The Bills had an unbelievable comeback win, unlike anything else. That just goes to show that this team does not give up. Josh Allen willed this team to a win. He played outstanding, just like an MVP should. The coaching was great towards the end. The defense really stepped up at the end, especially forcing that fumble on Derrick Henry. The only concerns are that the defense looked terrible through 3 quarters. At number 2, I've got the Packers. They looked unstoppable. They beat the Lions handedly. Their defense looked unbelievable as they held the Lions to 6 points through most of that game. Their offense looked really good as Jordan Love was passing the ball around to different receivers, and they have a lot of different weapons. There's just not one guy who stands out on that offense, but that defense, especially with Micah Parsons, seems like too much for most offenses to handle, and I do think the Packers are going to be a legitimate problem. But in at number 1, I've got the Eagles. They are still the best team in the league. Yes, they played the Cowboys really close, but that was without their best defensive player, and they still won in a divisional matchup. The Eagles are still the best team in the league. Their defensive line looks worse than it did last year, and their passing offense looked worse than it did last year. But that doesn't stop them from being the best team in the league. They won the Super Bowl last year for a reason. They still have Saquon Barkley. They still have Jalen Hurts. They both played outstanding. Their defense is playing really, really well, especially once Jalen Carter returns. And I really just see this team having a ton of potential yet again in this season. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and follow me on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And don't forget to tune in next week and every other week of the season, as I will be uploading as many weeks of this season as I possibly can. So thank you again for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.